Montana Territory, 1873. The morning sun pierced through gaps in the weathered barn, casting golden streams across the hay-strewn floor. Zachary Sutton paused, pitchfork in hand, to wipe sweat from his brow. At 25, he had already carved out his small piece of the frontier, a modest ranch nestled in a valley bordered by towering pines and distant mountains. The land was unforgiving, the seasons harsh, but it was his, bought with years of hard labor, calloused hands, and a stubborn refusal to fail. Zachary believed the frontier demanded solitude. His parents had taught him that lesson when fever took them both during the journey west when he was just 14. The wagon train had continued without pause, the harsh reality of survival overshadowing grief. In the years since, he'd built walls thicker than his cabin logs, convinced that attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. The frontier didn't care for sentiment. It respected only strength and self-reliance. A man needs nothing but his land and his livestock, Zachary often told himself, though the empty chairs at his dinner table silently argued otherwise. He'd built a home meant for a family, 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, even a small parlor with bookshelves, yet he slept alone, ate alone, and worked alone, save for old Samuel who helped with the cattle 3 days a week. His ranch was prospering, unlike many in the territory. 200 head of cattle, 16 horses, crops that yielded well, and timber enough to expand. He had what most men wanted, yet the silence echoed through his house each night, mocking his supposed contentment. Zachary shook off such thoughts and returned to his work. Samuel would be arriving soon, and there were fence posts to replace before the cattle were moved to the north pasture. The work would keep his mind occupied, as it always did. He was halfway through repairing the fence when he heard the approaching wagon. Expecting Samuel, he was startled to see a different rig coming down the long drive. It was Jefferson Miller, the storekeeper from Pinewood, the nearest town some 15 miles away. "Morning, Sutton," Miller called, pulling his team to a stop. "Miller," Zachary nodded, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Don't usually see you this far out." "Got a matter that might interest you." Miller gestured to the seat beside him. "Mind if I bend your ear for a moment?" Curiosity piqued, Zachary set down his tools and approached the wagon. "Something wrong in town?" "Not wrong, no. Fact is, my sister's girl just arrived from Boston, named Sophia Tucker. 20 years old and sharper than a tack. Studied teaching back east, but seems there ain't enough positions for educated young ladies there." Zachary shifted uncomfortably, already guessing where this was heading. The territory was desperate for teachers, but the nearest school was in Pinewood, and he had no children to educate. "She's staying with us for now," Miller continued, "but Clara and I are already bursting at the seams with our 5 youngsters. Girl needs work, and I recalled you mentioning wanting to get your books in order, maybe write to some of those cattle buyers back east." "I don't need a teacher, Miller." "Not asking you to educate cattle," Miller chuckled. "But the girl writes a fine hand, knows figures better than me, and needs something to occupy her until the school board decides whether to open a second classroom. Thought she might help with your correspondence, keep your accounts. She's willing to work for room and board plus a small wage." Zachary frowned, a young woman living in his house. The mere thought violated every rule he'd established for himself. Women meant complications. Complications meant vulnerability. "I work alone," he said flatly. Miller sighed. "Figured you'd say that. Well, if you change your mind, she'll be at our place." Poor girl traveled all this way hoping for something better than what she left behind. Shame to see such determination go to waste. As Miller departed, Zachary returned to his fence posts with renewed vigor, as if physical labor could drive away the conversation. Yet Miller's words lingered. His ledgers were a mess, and he'd been meaning to write to cattle buyers in Chicago and St. Louis. His handwriting was barely legible, and figures often confused him. Still, the thought of disrupting his carefully constructed isolation gnawed at him. He'd made his peace with solitude, hadn't he? 3 days later, Samuel failed to appear for work. A message arrived instead. His wife had fallen ill, and he needed to stay home to care for her and their children. Zachary found himself overwhelmed with chores, and when a summer storm blew in that afternoon, tearing loose one side of the barn roof, he knew he was fighting a losing battle. The following morning, he hitched his wagon and drove to Pinewood, telling himself he was just going for supplies. But his feet carried him to Miller's store, where Clara Miller greeted him with a knowing smile. "She's out back helping with the washing," Clara said before he could even speak his purpose. Zachary found her hanging sheets on a line, her golden blonde hair partially contained in a neat bun, the rest escaping in wisps that framed her face. She wore a simple blue cotton dress, practical for the work, yet somehow more elegant than the frontier clothing he was accustomed to seeing. When she turned at the sound of his approach, he was struck by clear blue eyes that assessed him with unnerving directness. "You must be Mr. Sutton," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Uncle Jefferson said you might come by." Her voice carried the refined tones of the East, yet lacked the condescension he'd expected. She extended her hand in a gesture both proper and surprisingly forthright for a woman. "Zachary Sutton," he confirmed, taking her hand briefly. "Your uncle mentioned you might be looking for work." "I am," she replied. "Though I should be clear, I came west to teach, and I still intend to do so when the opportunity arises. But in the meantime, I need occupation and income." Her frankness surprised him. Most women he'd encountered either simpered or stayed silent around men they didn't know. Sophia Tucker did neither. "I need help with correspondence and bookkeeping," he said stiffly. "Maybe 3 days a week. I can provide transportation to and from town on those days." She shook her head. "The arrangement would work better if I stayed at your ranch during the week. The journey would waste valuable working hours, and I understand you're some distance from town." Zachary frowned. "It wouldn't be proper." "I'm not proposing anything improper, Mr. Sutton. I would require separate accommodations and clear boundaries, but if you're uncomfortable with the arrangement, I understand." Her practicality disarmed him. There was no coyness, no hidden agenda he could detect, just a woman stating terms for employment. "I have a separate cabin," he found himself saying, "built it for a ranch hand who never showed up. It's small but sound." "That would be suitable. When would you like me to begin?" 2 days later, Zachary watched with growing unease as Sophia settled into the small cabin 50 yards from his main house. She had brought remarkably little with her, 2 trunks containing clothes, books, and personal items. The cabin was sparsely furnished with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small stove, but she seemed satisfied with the accommodations. "This will do nicely," she declared, placing a small vase of wildflowers on the table. The simple touch transformed the utilitarian space, making it suddenly, undeniably feminine. Zachary showed her his office, a small room off the main house that contained stacks of papers, ledgers, and correspondence in various states of disorder. If she was overwhelmed by the chaos, she didn't show it. "I'll organize these first," she said, already rolling up her sleeves. "Then we can establish a proper filing system. Do you have any pressing correspondence that needs immediate attention?" He mentioned the cattle buyers in Chicago, and she nodded, making a note in a small book she carried. "I'll draft letters for your approval by tomorrow afternoon. For now, perhaps you could show me your current bookkeeping methods so I can understand your system." "There isn't much of a system," he admitted reluctantly. Sophia's lips curved slightly. "Then we'll create one." The next few days established a routine. Sophia worked diligently in the office while Zachary tended to the ranch. They took meals separately, though occasionally she would leave a pot of stew or a fresh-baked loaf on his porch. Excess from her own cooking, she claimed, though he suspected otherwise. Her efficiency was remarkable. Within a week his office was transformed. Papers were filed neatly, ledgers balanced, and correspondence organized by priority. She drafted letters that somehow captured his thoughts while expressing them far more eloquently than he could have managed. "You've received a response from Mr. Davidson in Chicago," she announced one evening when he returned from checking the north pasture. She had taken to waiting on her cabin porch at dusk, providing updates as he passed by. "He's interested in purchasing up to 50 head and will be sending a representative next month." Zachary paused, surprised. That was fast. "I may have mentioned that other buyers were showing interest," she admitted with a slight smile. "Nothing untrue, merely emphasizing that decisions should be made promptly." He found himself smiling back before he could catch himself. "Remind me never to negotiate with you, Miss Tucker." "Sophia, please," she said, "and I negotiated for you, not against you." The distinction lingered in his mind as he continued to his house. For the first time in years, someone else was looking out for his interests. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. As weeks passed, Sophia's presence began to alter more than just his business affairs. The ranch seemed less isolated, the silence less oppressive. She had a way of filling spaces with purpose, whether organizing his chaotic office or planting flowers beside her cabin. When Samuel returned to work, he commented on the changes. "Place feels different," the older man observed, "brighter somehow." Zachary grunted noncommittally, but he couldn't deny the truth of it. The ranch was changing, he was changing, and the walls he'd built around himself were developing hairline cracks. One evening in late summer, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. Zachary was returning from the far pasture when the skies opened. By the time he reached the barn, he was drenched. To his surprise, Sophia was there, struggling to close the heavy doors against the wind. "What are you doing out here?" he shouted over the storm as he grabbed the door and heaved it shut. "Your mare is about to foal," she called back, pushing wet hair from her face. "I noticed when I walked by earlier. She seemed distressed, so I've been checking on her." Sure enough, his prized breeding mare was in labor in one of the stalls. Zachary had been expecting the foal, but hadn't realized it would come so soon. "You know about horses?" he asked, shrugging off his soaked coat. "My grandfather raised them in Virginia before the war," she explained, kneeling beside the mare. "I spent summers there as a child." Together they worked through the night, Sophia displaying a knowledge of horse breeding that surprised him. When the foal finally emerged, a strong colt with a white blaze, they shared a moment of quiet triumph. "He's beautiful," Sophia whispered, her face glowing with exhaustion and joy as the newborn wobbled to his feet. Zachary found himself studying her face rather than the colt. Her hair had come loose from its usual tidy arrangement, falling in damp waves around her shoulders. There was straw stuck to her skirt and a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She had never looked more beautiful. The thought startled him. When had he started seeing her as more than just an employee? "Thank you," he said awkwardly, "for helping." She turned to him, her eyes bright in the lantern light. "It was my pleasure. Some things are worth witnessing, no matter the hour or weather." As dawn broke, the storm passed and they made their way back to their respective homes, soaked and exhausted, but sharing a connection forged through the night's work. That morning marked a shift in their relationship. Conversations extended beyond business matters to personal histories and opinions. Zachary found himself sharing stories of his journey west and the early years of building his ranch. Sophia spoke of Boston, her education, and her dreams of establishing a proper school in the territory. "Why teaching?" he asked one evening as they sat on his porch, watching the sunset after reviewing the month's accounts. "I believe knowledge changes lives," she said simply. "Especially out here, where opportunities are limited by geography and circumstance. A good education can open doors that might otherwise remain closed." "Is that why you came west?" "To open doors." She considered the question. "Partly, but I also came for myself. Boston was constraining. Society there has very specific ideas about what a woman should be and do. Here, those rules seem less rigid. There's room to breathe, to define oneself." Her words resonated with him more than he expected. Hadn't he come west for similar reasons? To escape predefined paths, to create something of his own making. "And you?" she asked. "Why a ranch? Why here?" "Land," he answered immediately. "Back east, a man like me, no family name, no connections, would never own something substantial. Here, hard work and determination matter more than background." "A home of your own making," she observed. Yes, he hadn't thought of it quite that way before, but she was right. He'd been building not just a ranch, but a home, even if it was one he occupied alone. Until now, the realization unsettled him. Sophia had become more than an employee, more than even a friend. She represented possibilities he'd long denied himself, dreams he'd buried beneath pragmatism and fear. The walls he'd constructed were crumbling faster than he could repair them. Fall arrived, painting the surrounding hillsides in fiery hues. The cattle sale to Davidson's company had gone through successfully, bringing a substantial profit. Samuel commented that the ranch had never been in better condition, and Zachary knew that Sophia's organizational skills had played a significant role in that success. "The school board is meeting next week," she mentioned one crisp October morning as they reviewed winter preparation plans. "They're finally discussing the second classroom." Zachary felt his chest tighten. Of course, this had always been temporary. She had made that clear from the beginning. yet somehow he'd allowed himself to forget that her presence had an expiration date. "That's good news," he managed to say. "You'll make an excellent teacher." "Thank you," she hesitated, fidgeting with her pencil. "If they approve the position, I'd still have time to help here a few days a week. The school terms have breaks for harvest and planting, and Saturdays could." "No," he interrupted more sharply than intended. "You'll have your students to focus on, the ranch will manage." Her face fell slightly before she composed herself. "Of course. You're right." The following days passed with a new tension between them. Zachary found reasons to be away from the house during her working hours, throwing himself into ranch work with renewed intensity. The distance was necessary, he told himself. Better to sever attachments before they grew deeper. Yet each night, he found himself watching her cabin's window, the warm glow of her lamp a beacon in the darkness. Sometimes he caught glimpses of her moving about inside, reading or writing letters. Once he saw her dancing alone to unheard music, her shadow graceful against the curtains. The sight lodged in his chest like a physical ache. The day of the school board meeting arrived. Zachary offered to drive her to town, maintaining a careful formality as they traveled. She seemed equally reserved, responding to his few comments with polite brevity. At the town hall, he hesitated. "Would you like me to wait? I could run errands and collect you afterward." "There's no need," she said. "Uncle Jefferson will be here. I can stay with them tonight and let you know the outcome tomorrow." He nodded, ignoring the hollow feeling in his stomach. "Good luck, then." "Thank you, Mr. Sutton." The return to formality stung more than it should have. He watched her walk into the building, back straight, head high, every inch the composed, capable woman who had first extended her hand to him months ago. She belonged in town, among people, shaping young minds, not isolated on a ranch with a man who could barely acknowledge his own feelings, let alone express them. Zachary completed his errands mechanically, then headed to the saloon. He rarely drank, but tonight seemed to call for it. He was nursing his second whiskey when a commotion near the door caught his attention. 3 men had entered, rough-looking characters, trail dust still coating their clothes. They ordered drinks and spoke in low voices, but their presence changed the atmosphere of the room. These weren't local ranchers or townsmen. "Heard tell of a big cattle operation north of here," one of them said, loud enough for Zachary to overhear. "Fellow named Sutton, apparently just sold a big herd. Must be flush with cash." Zachary stiffened, keeping his face carefully neutral as he sipped his drink. The men continued their conversation, unaware of his presence. Their intentions became increasingly clear. They were planning to rob him, likely tonight, assuming the ranch would be minimally defended with the owner in town. What they didn't know was that Sophia might be returning to the ranch alone if her uncle was busy. The thought of her arriving to find these men there sent cold fear through him. Carefully, he set down his glass and slipped out the back door. He needed to warn her, then get back to the ranch before they did. The town hall meeting was still in session. Zachary paced outside, debating whether to interrupt. Before he could decide, the doors opened and people began to file out, Sophia among them. Her face was flushed with excitement, and when she saw him, her eyes widened in surprise. "Zachary, I thought you'd gone back to the ranch." "There's trouble," he said quietly, drawing her aside. 3 men in the saloon were talking about robbing the ranch tonight. They know about the cattle sale. Her hand went to her throat. "Are you certain?" "Yes, we need to alert the sheriff and get back to the ranch." They might already be on their way. Within minutes, they had informed Sheriff Collins, who promised to gather men and follow as quickly as possible. Zachary and Sophia headed for his wagon, urgency making them forget the awkwardness that had separated them earlier. "I shouldn't have left Samuel alone," Zachary muttered as they raced down the road. "He's there with just his hunting rifle." "You couldn't have known," Sophia said, clutching the seat as the wagon bounced over ruts. "And Samuel is no fool. He'll sense trouble." Night was falling as they approached the ranch. Zachary slowed the wagon, approaching cautiously along a back trail that wound through a stand of pines. When they reached the edge of the trees, he halted and helped Sophia down. "Stay here," he whispered, reaching for the rifle he kept under the wagon seat. "I'm coming with you," she insisted. "It's too dangerous." "2 sets of eyes are better than 1, she countered, "and I can shoot. My father made certain of that before he died." There was no time to argue. They moved together through the darkness, approaching the ranch house from behind. The main house was dark, but light spilled from the barn, where the safe containing the cattle money was located. They crept closer, staying in the shadows. Through the barn door they could see two men searching, while a third held a gun on Samuel, who was tied to a post. "Where's the money, old man?" one demanded, kicking over a barrel of feed. "Told you I don't know nothing about any money," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite his predicament. "The boss will be back any minute," another man said. "Maybe we should just wait for him, convince him to open the safe." Zachary and Sophia exchanged glances. The sheriff and his men were at least an hour behind them. They needed a plan now. "I'll create a distraction," Sophia whispered. "When they investigate, you can get the drop on them." Before he could protest, she had slipped away, circling toward the small cabin. Moments later, he heard breaking glass and saw flames. She had set fire to her own cabin. The outlaws noticed immediately. "What the hell is that?" one exclaimed. "Check it out," the leader ordered the youngest of the group. "Could be the rancher returning." As the man exited the barn, Zachary took his opportunity. He circled around, entering through the back door with his rifle raised. "Drop your weapons," he commanded. The two remaining outlaws turned, surprise evident on their faces. One went for his gun, and Zachary fired, hitting him in the shoulder. The man cried out, his pistol clattering to the ground. The leader was smarter, raising his hands slowly. "Easy now. No need for more shooting." Outside, a woman's scream pierced the night. Sophia. In the split second that Zachary's attention wavered, the outlaw leader lunged for his fallen comrade's gun. Samuel, despite his bonds, managed to kick out, tripping the man. Zachary brought the butt of his rifle down hard, knocking the outlaw unconscious. "Samuel, are you hurt?" Zachary asked as he quickly cut the older man's bonds. "Nothing serious, but that girl of yours." Zachary was already running toward the cabin, terror giving his feet wings. The cabin was engulfed in flames, illuminating the yard in flickering orange light. The third outlaw had Sophia by the arm, dragging her toward the horses tethered nearby. "Let her go," Zachary shouted, raising his rifle. The outlaw spun, pulling Sophia in front of him as a shield. "Drop the gun or she dies," he snarled, pressing a knife to her throat. Zachary hesitated, his finger on the trigger. At this distance, in this light, he couldn't risk a shot without endangering Sophia. But Sophia wasn't waiting for rescue. Her eyes met Zachary's for a brief moment, a silent communication passing between them. Then she went completely limp, dropping her weight suddenly. The surprised outlaw's grip loosened, and she drove her elbow hard into his stomach, then stomped on his foot with all her strength. As he howled and staggered back, Zachary fired, the bullet striking the ground near the man's feet. "Next one goes through your heart," Zachary warned, advancing steadily. "Drop the knife." The outlaw, seeing his position was hopeless, let the blade fall. Sophia quickly kicked it away, then moved to Zachary's side. Samuel appeared with rope, and together they bound all three outlaws securely. The sheriff and his posse arrived an hour later, finding the situation well in hand, though Sophia's cabin was now just smoldering ruins. As the prisoners were led away, Zachary finally had a moment to assess Sophia. She had a bruise forming on her cheek and her dress was torn at the sleeve, but she appeared otherwise unharmed. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "So could you," she countered. "So could Samuel." "But we weren't." Her calm in the face of danger amazed him. This woman, who had come west seeking a teaching position, had just helped foil an armed robbery with more courage than many men he'd known. "Your cabin," he said, glancing at the charred remains. "All your things." "Most of my books and personal items were in the main house office," she said, "and possessions can be replaced. Lives cannot." The adrenaline that had sustained them began to fade, and Sophia swayed slightly on her feet. Without thinking, Zachary swept her into his arms. "You need rest," he said, carrying her toward the main house. She didn't protest, instead resting her head against his shoulder in a gesture of trust that humbled him. Inside, he set her gently on the sofa in the parlor, then built up the fire. Samuel brought blankets and coffee before tactfully retiring to the bunkhouse, leaving them alone. Sophia sipped her coffee, her hands still trembling slightly. "I should tell you," she said after a long silence. "The school board approved the second classroom." Zachary's heart sank, though he forced a smile. "Congratulations, you deserve it." "Thank you," she set down her cup. "I start after the new year." You'll need a place in town, then. She studied him, her gaze searching. Is that what you want, for me to leave the ranch entirely? The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Zachary found himself at a crossroads, the walls he'd built crumbling completely. The thought of her leaving, of returning to his solitary existence, was suddenly unbearable. No, he admitted, the word barely audible. That's not what I want at all. What do you want, Zachary? She asked softly. He moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. When I came west, I believed the frontier demanded solitude, that attachments were weakness and a man could only rely on himself. He paused, gathering courage. You've shown me how wrong I was. This place, this home I've built, it was never meant to be empty. It was waiting for someone to share it with. It was waiting for you. Tears glistened in her eyes. And the school position. Pinewood is 15 miles away, not so far that you couldn't teach and still come home each night. Home to the ranch, home to me. Home, she repeated, the word carrying all the weight of their shared journey. Yes, I think I'd like that very much. His hand caressed her cheek, and she leaned into his touch. I love you, Sophia Tucker. I think I have since you first started organizing my chaotic life. Her laugh was soft and warm. And I love you, Zachary Sutton, though you might be the most stubborn man in the entire territory. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of all that was to come. Outside, the night settled over the ranch, their ranch, as the first snow of winter began to fall. The wedding took place in Pinewood's small church on Christmas Day, 1873. The town turned out in force to see their new schoolteacher marry the once reclusive rancher. Samuel served as best man, beaming with pride, while Clara Miller stood beside her niece. Sophia wore a gown of ivory silk that Clara had helped her sew, adorned with lace saved from her mother's wedding dress. Golden hair arranged in an elegant crown of braids, she carried a bouquet of evergreen and holly berries. Zachary, clean-shaven and dressed in his finest, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to face life's challenges together, to build on the foundation they had already laid. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up shook the rafters. The celebrations continued well into the evening, with dancing and feasting at the town hall. As midnight approached, the newlyweds slipped away, driving through the starlit night to their ranch, their home. Zachary had prepared a surprise during the weeks before the wedding. The main house had been transformed, with new curtains, rugs, and furniture. The parlor bookshelves were filled with volumes he'd ordered from Denver, many of them titles Sophia had mentioned losing in the cabin fire. But the greatest change was in the bedroom, now warmed by a quilt Clara had helped the town's women stitch as a wedding gift. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sutton," he said as he carried her over the threshold. Her arms tightened around his neck. "It's perfect," she whispered. Later, as they lay entwined beneath the quilt, Sophia traced the lines of his face with gentle fingers. "Do you remember what you said that first day in your office? About not having much of a system." "I remember," he murmured, catching her hand and kissing her palm. "I think we've created a rather good one now," she said, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "A system for living, for loving." "We have indeed," he pulled her closer, "and it's only the beginning." Spring brought renewal to the land and to their lives. Sophia taught in Pinewood during the week, riding to and from the ranch each day on the mare Zachary had gifted her. The journey gave her time to shift between her roles, teacher and wife, public figure and private partner. At the ranch, changes continued. Zachary expanded the cattle operation, using Sophia's organizational skills to create a more efficient business. Samuel moved into the rebuilt cabin, now serving as foreman for the growing number of hands required for the expanding ranch. By summer, Sophia had news of her own to share. One warm evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she placed Zachary's hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our family is growing," she said simply. The wonder in his eyes was answer enough, but he gathered her close, his voice thick with emotion. "A child, our child." That night he couldn't sleep, his mind filled with visions of the future, a child running through the meadows, learning to ride, filling the house with laughter. The home he had built would finally fulfill its purpose. In the dark hours before dawn, he slipped from bed and went to his desk, pulling out paper and pen. With careful strokes, he began to write a letter to their unborn child, telling the story of how two souls had found each other on the frontier, how love had transformed isolation into connection, how a house had become a home. "Your mother came west to teach," he wrote. "I had built this ranch seeking only land and livestock, but together we discovered that home isn't just a place, it's the people with whom we share our lives. You are the newest chapter in our story, little one, and we cannot wait to meet you." When he finished, he sealed the letter and placed it in a box he'd carved from pine. One day, when the time was right, he would share it with his child, this testament to the love that had defied the harsh realities of the frontier, that had broken through walls built of fear and loss, that had created a family where once there had been only solitude. Outside, the first light of day touched the eastern hills. Zachary returned to bed, gathering his sleeping wife gently in his arms. She stirred slightly, nestling against him with a contented sigh. In that moment, holding everything that mattered within the circle of his arms, Zachary Sutton knew a peace he had never thought possible. The frontier had not defeated love. Love had tamed the frontier, transforming his isolated existence into a life rich with connection and purpose. The ranch that had once echoed with silence would now resound with the voices of family. The home he had built would shelter generations, and the love he and Sophia had found would continue to grow, strong as the mountains that watched over their valley, enduring as the land itself.